morning, metalheads of the internet. The time has come. You asked and now you shall receive, but remember, you asked for it. My all-time favorite metal records! Yeah! I've been on YouTube for a few years now, but I never really took the Metal Meltdown that seriously. For me, this was just an outlet to vent about hard rock, heavy metal, and extreme music. I wasn't concerned with subscribers, I wasn't concerned with generating real conversation, and I wasn't really concerned with any controversy I might be delving into or in turn creating. Okay, well, I still don't really care about the latter. In fact, I relish any opportunity to piss people off. It's called the Metal Meltdown for a reason, after all. But the point being is that I do take this a lot more seriously, and over these past few weeks I've gone through a bit of a soft reboot here on the channel, trying to build a community that is open not just to all types of metalheads, but to all types of people to come in, to analyze this genre, to dissect this genre, to explore this genre to their liking, to their level of comfort, free of elitism, snobbery, intolerance. I guess to put it simply, I don't care if your favorite band is Imperial Triumphant or Gorguts or Intronaut or Black Veil Brides or Asking Alexandria. I may not always agree with you, but you are nonetheless welcome here. That is the new direction and goal of the Metal Meltdown, but before we walk down that path in that direction to that goal, I think it's time I finally addressed my most loyal, dedicated, and passionate followers who have asked for nothing more than to know my all-time favorite metal records. Truth be told, I've never really felt the need to make a video like this. I just haven't. I don't really have a great explanation, but you've been patient, you've been considerate, and when I openly asked y'all if you wanted to hear it, you came out in droves and you told me exactly how you feel. So here we are, let's do this, let's talk about my all-time favorite metal records. Some ground rules first though, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about 10 records. All of those 10 records are going to be from 10 individual bands. You're not going to see 5 albums from one band, 3 albums from another, 10 individual albums from 10 individual bands. I'm sure as you can imagine that a lot of records as a result have been left off of this list, a lot of very important and popular records, and I apologize in advance for that, but I wanted to keep this list as focused and as tight as possible. I really wanted to go into why these 10 albums are my favorite, and I can't really do that if I've got 50 records to talk about in this time span. With that in mind, let's go ahead and just rip a couple band-aids off right away. There's no Napalm Death on here, there's no Carcass on here, there's no Black Sabbath on here. It breaks my heart, but we have to do it. We gotta keep this list tight and focused, so c'est la vie. Secondly, these 10 records are sonically, inarguably metal. I say this because I truly don't care what fits your personal description of heavy metal. I don't care if you think a certain band is sold out. I don't care if you think a certain band is for posers. I don't care if you think that a certain sound, scene, or style is unmetal simply because you have deemed so. If it sonically fits any of the descriptions for any metal subgenre, it is fair game for my list. With that in mind, let's rip another band-aid off right away. There is a post-metal black gaze record on this list. Deal with it. If that bothers you, you can go ahead and talk to hipster black metal. I truly don't care. And last thing, this isn't as important as the other things, but something to note nonetheless. These albums are not ranked in any real order. It's not like we're going from 10 to 1 or 1 to 10. It's all alphabetical. Choosing 10 albums was hard enough, folks. Don't ask me to rank them. Fucking don't. And I think that's it. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's talk about my all-time favorite metal records. First up, Arise by Sepultura, released March 25th, 1991 via Roadrunner Records. I have always been impressed and fascinated by the likes of Sepultura. They are one of the most flexible and dynamic bands, not just within extreme music, but within all of heavy metal. Having gone from thrash metal to groove metal to death metal to nu metal to black and death metal to alternative metal, crossover thrash, hardcore punk, even dabbling in progressive and symphonic metal on their last 2 studio records, Machine Messiah and Quadra. Inarguably one of the most exciting and successful bands to come out of South America, Latin America, Central America. But this record is the cream of the crop for me personally. This is Sepultura at their darkest, at their most visceral, at their most abrasive, at their most ambitious, at least as far as this particular era is concerned, building upon their dark, brutal death metal sound with razor-sharp thrash metal riffs, weird industrial soundscapes influenced by the likes of Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, all wrapped up and bound into some of the tightest and hellish material ever put to tape and produced to near perfection by death metal maestro Scott Burns. Scott Burns has worked on many amazing records over the years, many of which are more than worthy of being on a list like this, but I would consider this to be his most ambitious and his most powerful work. It's so heavy and punishing that it's almost infectious, be it through the thundering, ominous thrash of Arise, the nightmarish brooding of Desperate Cry, or the jackhammer force of closing track Infected Voice. It all just slaughters! May I add as well, one of the greatest album covers of all time. That is like just evil personified through paint and ink. Sepultura have definitely changed a lot since this record came out. Many would argue, I'm sure, for the worse. But anything you can name that you would consider truly awful is forgiven simply by the power, the stride, and the energy of this lone record. A truly unfuckable extreme metal machine. I feel bad for anyone that does not regularly spin this beauty. Next up is Crack the Sky from Mastodon, released March 24th, 2009 via Reprise Records. This was one of the few records that from the beginning I knew I needed to have on this list, because this isn't just one of my favorite metal records, it's also one of the most important to me, as this record not only paved the way for my introduction to progressive metal, but to progressive music as a whole. This emotive, natural, spellbinding work of pure progressive genius is the reason why I love all progressive music the way that I do. And even as I've continued to explore this genre to its very limits, to its very edge, I have only found really a few other records that come even an inch close to the staying power and emotional peaks of this bad boy right here. Previous albums in the band's discography all represented elements, with Remission representing fire, for instance, and Leviathan representing water. This album sonically represents air, and as such feels untethered to the world as it is. Mastodon are so much more expressive, they feel so much more free on this record in comparison to their early records and even in comparison to their later records. They were playing around with huge epic soundscapes, multifaceted dual harmonies, huge scores of synthesizers, guitars, bass, drums, giving the record a very epic, even cinematic scale and scope without compromising its freedom, without forcing it to feel or sound a certain way. It still feels very light, very flexible, and as such is an album that I have been able to listen to in a variety of different circumstances and have been able to pull so much out of it in these different circumstances. It's an album I will listen to laying down in a grassy meadow. It's an album I'll listen to as a thunderstorm rains down above me. And yeah, big shocker, if I smoke a shitload of weed, this album's coming on too. Promise you, that opens a lot of avenues right there. Its ability to create different individual sonic experiences for every listen and every type of listener is absolutely remarkable, and makes it as well one of the most multifaceted records, not just within heavy metal or progressive music, but I would argue period. For those of you who remain unconvinced or perhaps unaware as to what I'm talking about, I ask you to spend a few moments listening to this record, and don't just watch, but feel the whole world change around you as you listen to these spellbinding, heart-wrenching melodies, these glorious guitars, these thunderous, earth-shattering drums. It's like a whole universe unto itself, one I look forward to getting lost into every time I pick up this record. Next up, Killing Technology from Voivod, released April 2nd, 1987 via Noise International and Combat Records. Some of y'all probably knew that I was going to have some Voivod on here. I regularly sing this band's praises. But I imagine those of you who would have anticipated me including a Voivod record on here might have expected me to include a record like Dimension Hatros. But Killing Technology just manages to inch just a little bit further than Dimension Hatros, partially because it takes the band's famous avant-garde wizardry and insanity and pairs it with some of the most bloodthirsty extreme thrash and speed metal that Canada has ever dared to brew. This thing isn't just heavy. This thing isn't just weird. It's heavy and weird. To the point where it continues to fucking blow people's minds literally the moment I begin to play it. I mean, this album is like coming face to face with like a Terminator that got possessed by venom. Cold, mechanical, poisonous, evil, unpredictable. It will kill and then consume you if given the chance. And yet you won't argue one bit. This album, in cooperation with another record that we will soon mention, kinda did for experimental and avant-garde music what Mastodon did for prog music for me. It just opened this this little mini universe as to what these genres were truly capable of when they wanted to be something more than just big riffs and big hooks. I mean, it still has those. I would even argue this record has some of the most underappreciated thrash jams of the 1980s. But it does so much more. Any band that dares to call themselves a technical death metal band, a technical thrash metal band, an alien core band, or some kind of sci-fi thrash metal band or whatever owes a debt of gratitude to Voivod. Because if it were not for them, if it were not for this record, they would not fucking exist. End of story. Side note, boom. Autographed too. Can't tell you how much I love that. There you have it, folks. If you ever want to find yourself lost in space, hurtling endlessly towards a black hole, this is the album for you. Next up on our list is an album that, honestly, I shouldn't have to explain to you. It's one of those records, ladies and gentlemen, one of those definitive, hallmark, legendary records. One of those records that, had it not been released, could have changed the fabric of time and space itself. This heavy metal universe as we know it does not continue to exist in the way that it does without an album like this. I am, of course, talking about the one, the only, Master of Puppets from Metallica. Released March 3rd, 1985 via Elektra Records, this third studio album from these thrash metal titans showcases the band at their most dominating, their most powerful, and their most cutthroat. Officially shedding the speed metal traditional heavy metal skin of Kill Them All, expanding on the more progressive flourishes of Ride the Lightning, in turn crafting not just their most powerful songs, not just their most powerful record, but truly one of the greatest metal records of all time. I mean, this is one of those records that, regardless of how you feel about modern Metallica, usually ends up on your list, even as an honorable mention. Because it's just that fucking good. I mean, there's not a single riff on here that does not crush like a ton of bricks. A single hook on here that does not ring into the corners of your mind. There is not a single moment on this record that will not blow your mind, even now in 2020, nearly 35 years after this album's release. But truth be told, ladies and gentlemen, even if all of this wasn't to some extent objectively true, this album would still end up on my list because, as it turns out, it's also the first metal album I ever bought with my own money. True story here, folks. It was maybe 2010, 2011. Exact time is a bit sketchy, but regardless, I was a teenager, just really starting to get into this genre, and my parents took me to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio. They had just added a bunch of material to the museum. If I'm not mistaken, Metallica had just been inducted, and they showcased a bunch of old records from them. They showcased a bunch of merch and memorabilia, and I heard a bit of the music in like some kind of intro movie they did when you walk into the Hall of Fame, and something about it just stuck with me immediately. There's this level of rage and fire that I had never heard in music before, that had never spoken to me this way before. And I loved it so much that before I left, I insisted on grabbing the little sucker on CD here. This is one of the few CDs I still keep to this day, actually. Metallica in general speak to me in a way that few other bands ever have. To me, Metallica is truly the soundtrack to the apocalypse, the soundtrack to every teenager's wildest dream and every suburban mom's most wild nightmare. And Master of Puppets is the pinnacle of said dreams and nightmares. I'm not going to sit here and pretend Saint Anger's amazing. I'm not going to sit here and defend the likes of Reload, Lulu. No, I'm not. But none of it really matters. None of it. Period. Because Metallica still gave us this, one of the greatest metal records ever made. This is where we might start to see a little bit of division, fair warning, but I think for the most part some of you will understand where I stand on this record and why I stand where I do on this record. We are talking about Obscura from Gorguts. Released July 23rd, 1998 via Olympic and Slip Disc, this album stands as one of the most challenging and unorthodox records I've ever listened to. Similarly to the aforementioned Killing Technology, it is a brazen display of Canadian experimentation and avant-garde mentality at its most fucked up and primal. But this takes things a step further, because Voivod at least were still interested in delivering something that still felt like a song. With this record, Gorguts mastermind Luc Lemay and his cohorts completely reinvent music itself. There is not a single sound or structure on this record that could be described as conventional in this lifetime or the next. Time signatures I'd never heard of until I heard this. Sounds I'd never heard until I heard them like this. It's an album that, to quote a friend of mine, literally breaks the rules of music and somehow still works. And while to this day it is still a very difficult album for me to sink my teeth into, it is nonetheless a very enjoyable record. As similarly to the aforementioned Crack the Sky, it offers a completely unique experience every single time I listen to it, to the point where every time I listen to it, there's something new I discover. It doesn't always make sense, and it is inherently a somewhat messy and unattractive record. This isn't something you're going to be throwing on at the summer barbecue. But it is an album that will expand and strengthen your musical palette. Even if you come out of this thing fucking hating it, you will come out of it with a new understanding as to how music can be presented. And if you don't believe me, folks, then listen to Sasha Dunable from Intronaut, or Mike DeSalvo of Acurion and Cryptopsy, or Trevor Strand of the Black Dahlia Murder. All gentlemen I have spoken to in the last few months here on the Metal Meltdown, all of who have nothing but praise to sing for this astounding record. This record is very much like a strong, strong, strong glass of scotch. You might gawk at it first, you might even cringe a little bit, it might be a little too strong for you, but give it time, exercise some patience, and you might find a lot going on in this tall glass. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, an album that may not be as prolific as Master of Puppets, but I would truly consider a definitive metal record, to the point where when I think of the word metal, it's this album that pops up first. This record in question being Painkiller by Judas Priest, released September 3rd, 1991 via Columbia Records. Judas Priest, arguably the first true metal band out there. Their sound, their image, their aesthetic defines what traditional heavy metal truly is all about. I mean, no disrespect to Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Cream, Jimi Hendrix, but they weren't the ones riding motorcycles all the time. They weren't the ones dressed up in leather carrying whips all the time. They weren't the ones with twin guitars in every single song all the time. That was Judas Priest. And this represents Judas Priest at their most metal and refined point ever. They had already crafted some truly legendary records by this point in time, Breaking the Law and Screaming for Vengeance, for example. But as the 80s raged on, Judas Priest quickly realized that traditional heavy metal wasn't going to cut it anymore. Bands like Metallica, Iron Maiden, Megadeth were getting bigger, better, stronger, more ambitious in their songwriting, in their execution, in their musicianship, and as such, if Judas Priest wanted to stick around, they had to do the same. So they crafted this absolutely stunning 50-minute monstrosity of pure metal fury, growing more technical, more precise, more flamboyant, especially Rob Halford himself, hitting some of his highest notes ever on this record, propelling the band to new levels of sonic brutality. To this day, there isn't a single hook that is not wedged into my brain. For that matter, a single riff, a single guitar solo that is not wedged in my brain. It's so metal that it's addicting. It's infectious. Like some kind of weird, crazy drug that I just can't get enough of. And it's proven to be genuinely influential here on the channel, because there happens to be a little track on this album called The Metal Meltdown, and that happens to be where the name of this channel comes from. I really don't know what else to say. I mean, I could sit here and make up some story about how it challenged me to become a better musician, to expand my musical horizons, but that's not the case. This thing's on here simply because it kicks extreme fucking ass. It's just a banger from start to finish. What more do you want me to fucking say? It was actually tricky to pick this next album because it features a gentleman that I knew I wanted to feature in some form, but I wasn't sure how. A gentleman who inarguably defines heavy metal in the way that the aforementioned Metallica and Judas Priest do, but unfortunately he has flip-flopped between so many projects, all of them having produced such incredible material, that it became extremely difficult to pick one album of his to feature. But I finally figured it out, folks. I finally figured out which record from this gentleman I wanted to highlight more than anything else, and that is Rising from Rainbow. Released May 16th, 1976 by Oyster and Polydor Records, featuring the one, the only, Ronnie James fucking Dio. I know that Ritchie Blackmore's in this band, but let's all be honest here. Dio's the fucking star. I thought about picking Holy Diver. It seemed like an obvious choice. I mean, for fuck's sakes, there it is hanging on my wall. I also genuinely thought about including Heaven and Hell. I love that record. But when I re-listened to this album, I knew it couldn't be those records or any other record that he has made with any other project. I knew it had to be this. This album paints a landscape of metal at its most epic and even beautiful. Lush synthesizers, huge banging riffs, incredible lyrics about fantasy and faraway lands, all propelled by the dynamic, versatile, godly voice of one Ronnie James Dio, in his absolute vocal prime, if you ask me. The production value on this record for 1976 is absolutely remarkable. This thing feels as gigantic as something like The Lord of the Rings, without losing its hard rock and traditional heavy metal mentality, without being lost in waves of pretentious fantasy garble. It remains raucous, it remains accessible, it remains approachable. A balance of soundscapes and identities that delivers a consistently immersive and incredible experience every single time you listen to it, regardless of your knowledge and expertise of this genre. Dio did a lot of good for heavy metal, but this is the best thing he ever gave us. With Holy Diver coming in at a sharp second, by the way, don't you worry. I haven't forgot about you, you beautiful, sweet prince. Next up is another one of those records that's frankly just kind of iconic. You should all know about this record to some extent, even if it isn't on your list of all-time favorite records. As such a record, I don't feel I need to explain that much, but since we're here, since that is the point of this, let's get into it. It's Rust in Peace from Megadeth, released September 24th, 1990 via Columbia Records. Warts and all, Megadeth remains one of my consistent metal bands. I won't pretend that they have a particularly consistent track record, nor will I pretend that I wish Dave Mustaine would shut the fuck up sometimes. But I'm willing to mostly look past it, because when Megadeth gets it right, they fucking get it right. This record in particular is a moment where they truly got it right. This is Megadeth at their best musically, lyrically, conceptually, officially solidifying Megadeth as a unique band and not just a byproduct of Metallica. In fact, on that note, I would go as far as to say that I actually prefer this over Master and Puppets, and if I were to give you a ranked list of my all-time favorite albums of all time, metal or not, or both, this would end up in the top 5. As far as the number 1 is concerned, and before someone asks, we will address the number 1. Give it some time, but for now, let's talk about this thrash-tastic little beauty. Part of what makes this record so dynamic is the addition of Marty Friedman and Nick Menza. These guys came in and they gave Dave Mustaine a serious kick in the ass. I think it's the first time in Megadeth's history where Dave was legitimately challenged by another guitar player, perhaps even feeling intimidated by Marty Friedman's insane skill, precision, and knowledge. As a result, the two are subconsciously somewhat battling each other for who has the best riffs, the best solos. And as a result of that, this album is just stacked to the brim with massive, world-shattering riffs and solos. The opening track alone, Holy Wars, features some of the best riffs ever put to tape. The main riff, the chorus riff, even that little part 2/3 in where it's like, that's just so fucking killer. That little part just builds so much tension and anxiety, and when it unleashes, it's just like, gah! And it ain't just Holy Wars, folks. Tornado of Souls in particular has one of the best guitar solos I've ever heard in my life. I love it so much that I could probably sing it for you note for note, as it's just been drilled into my head so many times over the years. Dave Mustaine's lyrics are especially striking and provocative here. I mean, this is the point where Dave Mustaine is at his most politically active without sounding like a goddamn lunatic. And many of his lyrics ring as true today as they did in 1990. I'd even argue more so given the modern chaotic political climate that consistently consumes our lives. It's a level of venom and anger that Megadeth have never been able to recapture, and it emerges at a time where thrash metal is beginning to slow down a little bit. I mean, by this time, Metallica is working on the Black Album, and Pantera is on the verge of becoming the next big thing. With that in mind, I'd go as far as to say that this was the last truly amazing thrash record of those times. Dave Mustaine and I may not see eye to eye on everything, but that hardly matters when Rust in Peace comes on, his greatest work and one of the greatest metal records of all time. This next record may come as a shock to some of you who are familiar with my apprehension towards comedy metal or any kind of metal with an overly satirical, tongue-in-cheek edge. Cough, cough, grandpa metal. Ooh, gotta get that checked out. But I have those apprehensions because this album in question is so fucking good, so fucking powerful, so topical, still funny to this day, so much, that I feel it has become the standard for any kind of comedy satirical metal record. I feel as if this album has done for this style of metal what Master of Puppets and Rust in Peace have done for thrash. This record in question being Speak English or Die from the Stormtroopers of Death, released August 30th, 1985 via Megaforce Records. This is a fascinating project because this is a point where metal is just really beginning to blossom into the mainstream, beginning to evolve and really progress into what we really know as metal. And yet in comes Anthrax's Scott Ian, apparently having seen into the future, having seen how metal, at least some parts of it, would be embodied and co-opted by highly conservative audiences and members of the alt-right, even neo-Nazis, in turn taking their fears, their prejudices, their blatant discrimination and intolerance, and twisting it into this weird, confusing, crossover thrash beast. An album so consistently poking and prodding at all of the people that would type in the comments right now, "Fuck you, poser," or something along those lines. And yet, brilliantly, so many of them have never realized it. They have approached this as if it is just yet another meat and potatoes thrash record. They've just gone, yeah, it's metal, it's got riffs, and it's tight. That's all I need to know. Scott Ian trolled y'all back in 1985, and you people don't even fucking realize it. It's incredible. And perhaps even more ironically, some people would actually embrace this album as if there was inherent truth to this, as if S.O.D was being serious when they said some of the things on this record. It's just, oh, it's beautiful. It's fucking beautiful. Fucking Brian Posehn fanboys are like, you don't understand satire, you don't understand comedy, but they'll treat this as if this is the real deal. It's mind-blowing. I love it. I love this fucking record. Much like Rust in Peace, there's a lot about this record that remains so poignant and topical and powerful to this day in 2020, especially as, apparently as Scott Ian predicted, metal genres have been co-opted by far-right organizations and movements. It makes this feel inherently timeless, inherently powerful, and inherently funny as it continues to poke, prod, and confuse people to this day. And it helps as well that this is some seriously tight, ferocious material. I mean, so much so that S.O.D kind of accidentally created not just a new way of approaching satire in metal, but they kind of accidentally invented a whole new subgenre of music, crossover thrash. I'd even argue the earliest stages of metalcore. Hell, I think even Banger Film tried to argue that at one point, and metalheads ripped them to shreds for that. It just has this uncompromising, unfuckable energy to it, the spunk of true hardcore music, with the heft and might of thrash metal, with the comedic and apparently subtle spitfire of Scott Ian, at least subtle to the extent that people still to this day don't get what this album is about. I really can't stress that enough, people. Like, there's still people that think that this is 100% serious. It's amazing. I hope this thing continues to poke, prod, and confuse people long after I am dead in the ground, because that alone is testament to how powerful, provocative, and intelligent this record is still to this day. Bravo, Scott Ian, metal's true original troll. Okay, so I'm not really sure how to properly introduce this final record, so what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to show it to you really quick, and you're gonna say whatever you need to say really quick in the comments, whatever makes you feel better. You know, you can call me a liberal, a pussy, SJW, some kind of homophobic, ableist slur, whatever. I'm a poser. I don't understand black metal. Go for it. I don't care. I've heard it all before. It doesn't hurt me. Get it off your chest. And then after that, we'll have an actual discussion about this record and why it's on this list. So without further ado, boom. Here it is. Say what you gotta say. It's cool. Pause the video if you have to. I'll wait. In fact, you know what? I'll even fetch myself a little drink while you type your comments. There we go. There we go. I really should have put this down first, but too late. Ah! Boom. You done? You got your comments in? Okay. So let's talk about Sunbather from Deafheaven. Released June 11th, 2013 via Death Wish, hardly the first album to see any kind of fusion between post-metal and black metal, but definitely the most successful, definitely the most provocative, and definitely the most controversial, even still to this day, particularly amongst those who would consider themselves true connoisseurs of black metal. On some level, I do understand inherently why. I mean, this is a far cry from the likes of Early Mayhem, Burzum, Dark Throne. But to be honest, that's why this record was so endearing to me upon release, and that's why it remains so endearing to me to this day. There's a certain elegance, honesty, beauty, emotional vulnerability to this record that I don't often see not only in black metal, but within heavy music and rock music. Deafheaven isn't concerned with showing you how tough they think they are. They're not concerned with corpse paint and bullet belts and wandering around in the woods with axes. What matters to them is the heart, the soul, the integrity of their music, and it is all reflected in this immersive, atmospheric, black gaze adventure of an album. I guess to put it more simply, you're not objectively wrong to suggest that this is not a black metal record at the core, because it kinda isn't. It simply chose black metal to communicate its message, and as such I feel has transformed black metal into a much more emotional and cathartic beast than I previously would have anticipated back in 2013. I guess what I'm trying to say by that is this album paved the way for me to eventually like black metal. Its riffs, its beats, its keyboards, its heart-wrenching vocals and soundscapes, it's all just so powerful. It was an experience that, to be honest, on very first listen did bring me to tears. I felt the power of Deafheaven immediately, and I was refreshed to find that it could be so expressive and dynamic and extreme without having to masquerade about in fucking Alice Cooper cosplay ranting about Satan and Vikings and God knows whatever else. Deafheaven feels so much more real to me in comparison to so many of the bands that would fall into that description. I think with other records like New Bermuda and Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, they've gotten a little bit sidetracked by trying to expand and refine on some of the more post-rock, alternative rock inspired elements of their sound. I don't blame them for doing that, and honestly I would still call both of them great records, but they don't quite rise to the level of this. This album really is a lightning in a bottle moment for Deafheaven, for atmospheric black metal, for black gaze, whatever the fuck you want to call it. I would go as far as to call this album a genuine masterpiece, and similarly to the likes of the aforementioned Crack the Sky and Colored Sands, an album that I can potentially revisit time and again, find so many new things, and completely dive into these new emotional universes that I had not previously encountered. When somebody says to me they don't like black metal, Honestly, this is one of the first albums I recommend to them. And all of the time, even if they don't like the record, they'll still always come back to me and say, wow, this was not what I expected at all. And again, even if they don't necessarily like this album, I have found that when I recommend it, when they come back to me with that response, they are then encouraged to go explore more of black metal. And I think that should be celebrated. I'm not saying you have to love this fucking record. You're more than entitled to hate this fucking thing. Go ahead, it's a free country. But shouldn't we celebrate that more people want to explore black metal because of records like this? I'm at least happy, because if it weren't for this record, I probably still wouldn't give two shits about the likes of Enslaved and Emperor and so many more. Okay, well maybe I would have eventually, and it's hard to really tell for sure, but the point is this album paved a path for me that at the time I don't think could have been paved otherwise. And honestly, the fact that it continues to inspire so much debate to this day only proves just how important this album is to black metal and to the heavy metal community. So fuck the black metal nerds and trolls. I really couldn't give a shit. This is one of my all-time favorite records. If I were to review it today, it would get a 5 out of 5 for me. One of the few records I would truly call a masterpiece. And I would recommend this to anybody disenchanted with black metal and looking for something far more honest, humble, and beautiful to sink their teeth into. Oh my god, we did it. We finally did it. 10 albums. Ah, that was way harder than I thought it would be. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. Of those 10 records, I would not call any of them my number one favorite album of all time. No, unfortunately not. All incredible. Legendary, even. But not my number one all-time favorite record. That particular distinction belongs to an album that I almost included on here, but unfortunately, I have to follow my own rules. I cannot include an album that we cannot inarguably consider a full-on metal record, and when I asked you if you thought this album was a heavy metal record, a majority of you said no. So, I could not throw it on the list. But if we had, it would be number one, because it's my all-time favorite record. Here we go. It's Appetite for Destruction. Guns and fucking Roses. Is it hard rock? Is it heavy metal? According to y'all, the former. I would argue to some extent the latter. Here's what we can't argue. This thing's fucking amazing! I cannot think of another album that so perfectly describes everything fantastic about rock and fucking roll and every single one of its subgenres. I cannot think of another album that continues to inspire such rage and rebellion within me to this day. It's sleazy, it's dirty, it's nasty, it's in your face, it's catchy, it's serene, it's surprisingly beautiful, it's surprisingly epic at times. It is everything beautiful about this genre, wrapped up in a beat-up leather jacket carrying a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey. Rock and roll at its hungriest, its most chaotic, its most destructive, its most primal, its most fucking badass. I love this fucking record. There's literally not a single moment of this record that I do not love with all of my heart. The percussion from Steven Adler is incredible. That infectious punky bass guitar from Duff McKagan. Literally bass lines you can sing along to. They're so fucking catchy. The dynamic guitar work of Slash and Isley Stradlin perfectly capturing the sonic beauty of guitar heroes like Joe Perry, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, and so many more. And the thunderous banshee wails of the one and only Axl Rose. This really is the definitive rock album in my opinion, folks. I mean, even at the time, this album had the ability to appeal to literally everyone all at once without pissing any one community off. I mean, this band had the ability to tour with Poison and Motley Crue, and then like a month later, tour with Motorhead and Metallica, and no one batted an eye. They managed to somehow float in between the middle of hard rock, heavy metal, glam, and even pop music. And they managed to still do that today. There's not a single radio station out there that won't play at least one song from this record. Granted, it's usually Sweet Child of Mine, but nonetheless. Like, I don't give a fuck about Use Your Illusion, The Spaghetti Instance, GRNR Lies. We can debate those records until the end of time. I'm fine with that. But this, don't even think about it. This thing's unfuckable. This thing's untouchable. Don't even try. Your skin will fucking corrode the moment you try to. Look, the point is that this is my all-time favorite record. Maybe not a metal record, even if I can argue it has metal elements in it, but nonetheless, my all-time favorite record. And that is it! Thank you for watching. We are finally at the end. I hope if you are amongst those who have asked for this that you have enjoyed this. I hope if you are brand new to this, if this is your first time watching the Metal Meltdown, you've gotten a taste of what this is about, and I hope to see you around. I might do more videos like this in the future, especially since June is looking a little all over the place for new releases, so let me know. Do you want to know my all-time favorite black metal records, my all-time favorite thrash metal records, my all-time favorite, I don't know, fucking glam rock records? I don't fucking know. Let me know. Maybe we'll make this a regular thing. Until then, make sure you press this button right here so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. Tell me about your all-time favorite metal records, and as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.